Okay? Right. One more to go. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the next item has caused us considerable trouble this week. We had made arrangements during the week to invite two people on the Late Late Show, and we are accustomed in broadcasting, and especially on the Late Late Show, to a fair amount of complaint and indeed abuse about programmes. And that is right and fitting. I think that broadcasters should be regularly subject to criticism of the most virulent kind. But we have seldom, in our 23 years of the Late Late Show, experienced a barrage of complaint and criticism about this next item as we have experienced this week. Some of it very nicely put, very charitably, very tolerant in writing and on the telephone. Alas, some of it, mainly anonymous callers on the telephone, being extraordinarily hostile, aggressive, abusive, and indeed on occasions obscene, which is a great pity. And as I say, we are accustomed to that sort of thing. The item is about a book called Breaking Silence, Lesbian Nuns on Convent Sexuality, edited by Rosemary Curb and Nancy Manahan, who are our next two guests on the show. Now, if this is the item which you think would be upsetting to you and the members of your family, then perhaps it would be a good thing to warn you that this is going to take up about 28 minutes, the following 28 minutes on the Late Late Show, and you may be advised to leave us now on the Late Late Show for the night, and thank you for joining us so far. Breaking Silence, Lesbian Nuns on Convent Sexuality is a collection of essays and interviews involving girls who went into convents in America, some of them upwards of 20-25 years ago, and found there that they had lesbian tendencies. And these are interviews and essays recounting their experience in that context in the convent. Now, as well as Rosemary Curb and Nancy Manahan, we have with us tonight Sister Maura. Sister Maura is of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion in Ballinter, up by Navanway. She has been 45 years a nun, and I have known her not for 45 years, but for a long number of years at any rate. We also have with us Father Raphael Gallagher, who is a Redemptorist, and he is a lecturer in moral theology in Kimmage and in TCD, and indeed has written papers on the particular and specific subject of homosexuality. Now, can I start with you, Father Raphael? And you've both read the book, you and Sister Maura. Reaction from you first: shock, horror, amazement, outrage?
None of them, Gay. My first reaction was, like yourself, I read the subtitle, and I thought that I was going to be outraged or shocked, even though I think it would take a bit to shock me at this stage. The book isn't, in my view, about what the subtitle says it's about, or what the blurb at the back says it's about. The book, for me, if I can put it this way, Gay, is to be read as, firstly, as a comment on convent life, primarily in the years between 1955 and 65, as they say. And it's a confused book for me. Confused in the sense that I didn't think a lot of the pieces were well written. And the main message of the book for me, as I read it at this distance, was that it showed a generation of people who entered the convent who were quite confused entering the convent themselves, a lot of them, who were given very bad formation by the religious communities at the time. I hope the book is unrepresentative that way, but a lot of the sort of formation advice the people got struck me as absolutely outrageous. The religious communities showed little or no leadership in coming to terms with this issue. And I think the net result is that the people who entered religious life in a confused way came out even more confused, not just on the lesbian issue, but even on wider and more fundamental issues. It's interesting that of the nearly 50 authors, 50 different contributions, only 5 of them have remained in touch with the Catholic Church. They've been deeply confused about issues of faith and belief. So my reaction to the book was a sadness that people with ideals, some of them I think should never have been allowed into the convent.
Would they get into convents now, Father, do you think?
I don't think so.
Why so? Have the recruitment procedures changed so much?
The recruitment procedures have changed, and I think most convents now have a procedure of psychological testing. to talk about sort of fairly extreme examples in the book, and some of the examples in the book are not as extreme as this. Some of the people admit to entering the convent for the strangest of reasons.
Indeed.
Some of them, it seemed to me that they were looking for explicit sexual experience. Some of them admit to having had no faith. They were confusing themselves. I'm not saying that these aren't problems, but entering the convent isn't the way that one deals with these problems. And I would think that convent formation nowadays would not accept these people into the convent.
And it is purely the American experience we're talking about. It is the American experience.
Yeah,
are things so vastly different there to here?
Vastly different is putting it a bit strongly. It's a different culture. I myself am just back from a year after working in America, so I'm relatively familiar with the American scene. One of the big differences that strikes me, the difference between the American church and the Irish church, is I found the American church much more polarized. A much more extreme right wing, despite the messages you got this week. Much more extreme right wing and a much more extreme reaction to that. And I found it more difficult over there. And I think this book might bear out my point, that when you're talking about a serious moral issue, like lesbianism or like feminism, and they are serious issues, or talking about a very serious issue like religious life, they're issues that you'll only discover if you discuss them reasonably and with a certain sort of dispassionate calm. And to throw all one's fury into the thing, from either side of the extreme. I noticed that difference in America, that with all our faults here, we say things, we talk things out straight, but I think we're ultimately less extreme.
You could have fooled me this week, Father, but however, I take your point.
That's why I mentioned the point.
Yes, Sister Maura, what about you? You're 45 years a nun. Were you shocked, horrified, whatever, by the book?
No, I wasn't. I began reading the book expecting to be horrified, and I was quite disappointed in the sense that I found really, what I found about the book was that it was a collection of case histories. I found that they demonstrated to me a certain sort of fascination for the mystery of what religious life is for some people. I felt a great sadness for the experiences of those women, and I knew well from my own experience that it was historic in the sense that during those years, religious life, the structures of religious life were as they are talked about in that book. There's truth in that.
Do you mean terribly strict with regard to holy silence and
yes,
particular friendships? Yes, there were a lot of
structures that were protective and that. And so that I felt that reading it in the light of today's experience, then it just seemed rather old hat. I found it quite hard to finish reading the book because it became very repetitive. I think I had a feeling of regret that women's lives were exposed in this way, because I felt that the book was neither a psychological or a sociological analysis, and it probably was never meant to be that, and there was no conclusion.
Yes, they were just recounting experiences.
Just recounting experiences.
Yes. Rosemary and Nancy, it seemed to me reading the book that in many cases the compassion and understanding was all one way. It was in one direction. In other words, what I mean is that most of the people complained of the lack of compassion and understanding on the part of their sisters in religion, and yet they didn't hesitate to, whilst remaining anonymous, some of them themselves, to mention the various convents they were in, which seemed to me rather unfair because it seemed to cast aspersions on their colleagues.
I don't think that that's true, Kay. Mentioning the order that they were a part of,
yes,
in their point of view, certainly does not cast aspersions on it, or they wouldn't have done it. But there are two factors there. One is that Rosemary and I and the hundreds of women we talked to, and then finally the 50 who are included in the book, expected this to be a very small publication through a very small feminist publishing house in Florida. Of the 50 books that they had published previously, none of them had ever remotely approached being bestsellers or crossed over into mainstream. So really, we were writing a book for a small community of feminist scholars and
it was
lesbian
arising out of your
sisters.
being banned on the program in Boston that you became celebrities almost overnight.
I'm not really sure about that, but I'd like to comment on the title and also on what Father said about the subtitle and the back cover. That was not our choice. We never would have used the subtitle on Convent Sexuality because it is not, in fact, a book about sexuality. It's a book about women's lives, and I'm a professor of women's studies at Rollins College in Florida. And we have a flood of books that have been very valuable in women's studies about women telling their, call it case histories if you will, the stories of some particular aspect of their lives, a particular community within a community of women. And that's what I saw this book as. Initially, Nancy and I really were just reaching out for our sisters in the feminist community, in the women's studies community. We never anticipated, at first, we weren't even thinking of a book. Then we never anticipated that the book would be any more than one within our small circle.
Yes, but whatever about the book and your intentions for it, how about Father's point that many of these people, it seemed to him and it seems to me, should never have joined the convent in the first place?
I can't say that.
I think that probably that's an accurate point, perhaps not for exactly the same reasons you mentioned, but I think that for many of us, we shouldn't have joined the convent. And if we had had more choices in the 50s and 40s and 60s when we were making these decisions, if there had been more choices for women, we would have made another choice. But at that time, it seemed that our alternatives were to be married, be good Catholic mothers, and if we didn't feel drawn to that, and if we did have a strong spiritual bent, which many of us did, and a very strong desire to serve people, most of us were terribly altruistic. I don't know of a single story in the book where the motivation for entering was anything sexual. That seemed to be
yes.
unconscious.
Virginia Apuzzo, she said, I was fully aware of my homosexuality when I joined the Sisters of Charity, and I stayed 3 years searching for answers to fundamental questions, which prompts the wish that she might have gone somewhere else to find the answers.
Yes,
I mean, it's a peculiar thing to do.
She also says in her story that she had no intention of being sexually active in the convent, and nor was she. She was aware of her lesbian orientation. And in America today, the community of sisters that I belong to explicitly states that they do not discriminate against entrance on the basis of sexual orientation, that women who identify themselves as lesbians are welcome in this particular community. It's understood that they will be...
What kind of community is that?
It's Dominican sisters.
Dominican sisters?
Yes.
You mean the official Dominican sisters?
The official
or?
Dominican sisters, yes. But we're talking about it, when we say lesbian, perhaps we should clarify that we're not speaking necessarily of sexual activity. We're speaking of a sexual orientation, but we're also speaking about a spiritual and political commitment to loving women, working for women. And that is the bond that connects the women in the book.
That's a rather vague definition compared with the definition that most people have.
Well, that's it. And so I hope that one of the values of the book, now that it has become such a mainstream bestseller, now that so many people are reading it, I hope that it has the educational value of dispersing that particular myth. Lesbians do all sorts of things, and I think the word has had very negative connotations for some people. And yet it has very positive connotations for me and for many in the women's studies community.